Welcome to the Talking Book Voices, the podcast, where we explore the wonders of the Texas Talking Book program. Join us in making literature accessible to all. This program, a division of the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, provides a free library service to Texans of all ages with a qualifying visual, physical, or reading disability. In each episode, we'll uncover its history, share stories, get updates, and tips to maximize this invaluable program. So whether you love reading, seeking accessible materials, or just curious about the program, this podcast is for you. Visit www.texastalkingbooks.org for more info. So let's begin the Talking Book Voices, a podcast by the Texas State Library and Archives Commission.
Did you know the Talking Book program offers bi-monthly author talks? Well, we do. You don't need any special technology. All you need is a phone. For more information, call us at 1-800-252-9605. Hi, podcast listeners. My name is Laura Jean, and I have been a Reader's Advisory Librarian here at TBP for 9 years now. Before that, I've worked as a library assistant at various different academic and public libraries for 12 years.
Hi, I'm Kayleigh, and I've been a Reader's Advisory Librarian with TBP for almost 3 years now. Today, we're going to talk about the genre of fantasy. But first, what is Reader's Advisory? One of our major responsibilities as Reader's Advisory Librarians is to know about the different types of books that are available to our patrons. One way to categorize books is by genre. What exactly is genre fiction? For our purposes, a genre is a group of books that have a similar subject matter, like mysteries or fantasy. So, tell me a little bit more about what defines the fantasy genre.
Well, at their core, fantasy fiction is speculative fiction. Speculative fiction always asks the question, what if? And in the case of fantasy, the question is, what if magic and magical creatures were real?
So, like Lord of the Rings type thing. Because bad librarian confession here, I tried to read Fellowship of the Ring and I gave up about 40 pages in. I just couldn't get into it.
Okay, first, no bad librarian. You can't read everything. You only need to know about it to recommend it to someone who might appreciate it. And second, it's perfectly okay not to like a book, even if it's a classic. You're an individual with personal preferences, and that's okay too. And finally, Tolkien is not for everyone. Fellowship of the Ring is a classic of the fantasy genre, but Tolkien created the world of Middle-earth and based it heavily on European myths and legends. So if you're not into that, that's not going to be your type of book. There are fantasy books that have worlds based on myths and legends of Asia or Africa, or if you want a more familiar setting with less need for learning about a completely original world for a setting, low fantasy or urban fantasy might be your thing.
I don't know, man. Those books are thick. They can be kind of intimidating.
Yes, they can definitely be that for sure. And not just that, but some of them are multi-book series. So you have to ask readers if they're into a series. Oh, and if they're okay with an unfinished series. I mean, do you really want to start the Kingkiller Chronicles or the Song of Ice and Fire series knowing that there's a chance there will never be closure? Plus, man, Fellowship of the Ring was published 70 years ago. So many wonderful fantasy books have been written since then. There are so many different types of fantasy out there. So much more than just high fantasy.
High fantasy? What's that?
It's just one of countless subgenres of fantasy. Let's see. There's high or epic fantasy. Those have an alternate world, heavy world building, lots of magical elements or magical creatures, and they tend to be multi-book series and serious doorstops. Low fantasy, magical elements and magical creatures, but they're intruding on the known world. So there's less world building there. You've got science fantasy, and this is kind of like a genre blend of science fiction and fantasy, so technology and magic or magical creatures. You also have dark fantasy, which is another genre blend, kind of fantasy meets horror, one of my personal favorites. You have alternate history or historical fantasy. So it's a reimagined history with settings you'd recognize, but with a magical twist. So Naomi Novik's Her Majesty's Dragon series is a good example. Europe during the Napoleonic era, but with dragons. Urban fantasy. So this is related to low fantasy in that magic meets the big city, but they take place in urban areas like Chicago, like the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher. Or in the case of The City We Became, it's New York, but an alternate version of the world where cities become sentient. Urban fantasy also tends to have a mystery element, so it may be a good entry point for mystery readers who might be interested in trying fantasy, but really aren't up for intense world building or multi-book series or books that double as doorstops. And magical realism, even lower than low fantasy. You've got real world, but with just a little kiss of fantasy. And it's a great start for those readers who like general fiction, but just aren't sure about trying fantasy yet. And related to that is cozy fantasy.
I'm sorry, that's a thing?
Yes, it is a thing. Legends and Lattes is a good example. Cozy fantasy is like cozy mysteries for fantasy. You've got low stakes action, nice likable characters set in an approachable magical situation with happy ending.
Wow, okay, so that's a lot of different types of fantasy. It's obviously not one size fits all.
No, not at all. There's really a little bit of something for everyone who's comfortable with or seeking to stretch their imagination a bit.
Okay, well, why do people read fantasy then? Obviously, to escape the real world, but with so many different types of fantasy, what are some general appeal factors?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So, fantasy tends to have the following appeal factors. You've got world building, okay? So, fantasy is a location genre like science fiction or historical fiction or westerns. So, a big part is the world building aspect. Now, this isn't just the setting, though, it's the backstory of the characters and how the fantastic creatures fit into that world, and also the way magic works in this world. You also have storyline. These are often strong contrasts in fantasy. You got good versus evil, light versus dark. But ultimately, except in dark fantasy, you tend to have a positive ending. The hero successfully finishes the quest. The merry band that was separated is united again, that kind of thing. The tone and the mood, it can change depending on the author. In general, even in the optimistic fantasy, there's generally darkness and turmoil during the course of the journey. Humor is also very common in fantasy. You see a lot of pun-like in the Piers Anthony Xanth novels or the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. But there are also authors who write with a more gallows humor like Jim Butcher. And the characters. The characters can be stereotypical types that are recognizable by fans, like the hero, for example, but they can also be multi-layered and deeper than you might expect. A common trope is a protagonist who is on a journey of self-discovery, and for this reason, it can be a popular genre for young adults.
I can see that. What are some popular themes in fantasy?
Well, I'll cover some of the more common and popular themes because there are so many different ones. And you'll often see a mix of a couple of different themes being used together. So you've got things like academies of magic.
Oh, like Harry Potter, right?
Exactly. Like Hogwarts in the Harry Potter universe, or the rightful heir, or the chosen one, which is also like Harry Potter. You've got a main character that has been long awaited to save the day, or kill the evil bad guy, or bring balance to the force. Whatever. You have court or political intrigue. Um, these are nice for those who like the spy thriller kind of idea, but just with a magical twist. You've got the loss or the return of magic to a world. So it can be a world where there's a threat to the magical system in the book, or it can even be a situation where magic may have been lost. Last Smile in Sunder City by Luke Arnold has a world where magic has left, but there are still magical critters. And the main character is also a private investigator, so you have that nice mystery aspect as well. You've got the concept of the gods provide. So religion can play a big part in that world building or magic system. Sometimes the gods may not even be all that powerful. Like in God Killer by Hannah Kaner, it has a protagonist that goes around killing upstart gods. That's her job. And then you've got, like, vengeance. That's, a very common one. Scum and villainy, usually, that's involved in a class-based world. You've got thieves and assassins, mercenaries, bad people doing bad things, but sometimes because they have to, just to get by.
Oh, like Six of Crows.
Exactly, another great example.
I know that one was really popular. So, what about current trends? What's popular right now in fantasy?
Witches, like Venko by Cherry Demeline, or Bindle Punk Bruja, which is really neat because the author is viewing serious issues like colonialism or gender through the eyes of witches. You're still dealing with serious concepts, but at a slight remove. So the reader is still introduced to those topics, but in a less abrasive way.
Oh, nice. What else is currently big?
Romantic fantasy. It's still fantasy at the core, but with a strong romantic element running through. And recentering the narrative is really popular right now.
Oh, like earlier when we were discussing how Lord of the Rings was based on a Eurocentric narrative.
Yes, yes. Some authors are placing their characters and plots in settings that are Asian inspired, like Fonda Lee's Green Bone series, or African inspired, like Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. Related but slightly different, they are also using stories and myths from other parts of the globe, not just Europe. So they're taking traditional African, Asian, or Mayan legends and using those as a base for the fantasy narrative. So, like Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia.
Okay, so like a retelling of myth like Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik.
Exactly. That's another current trend in fantasy novels and series right now, retellings or reimaginings.
Okay, well, I'm willing to try a fantasy book, but nothing with too much world building.
What's your favorite genre usually?
Oh, I love horror.
Oh, okay, good. Then I suggest a dark fantasy, but set in this world. So maybe an urban fantasy. Changeling by Victor Laval takes place in New York, but there is a dark force at play. Or it's old, but have you read The Gunslinger by Stephen King?
Yeah, when I was 12, but I figured that was a weird Western.
Oh, yeah, no, you can definitely categorize it that way. Absolutely. Remember, we are the ones attempting to pigeonhole these books. Authors write what they want to write, irrespective of these categories. We simply use them as tools to try and find patrons who might enjoy them. So you can categorize Gunslinger as a weird Western or a dark fantasy or both. It's really more of an art than a science. Let's forget about books for a minute. Do you play any board games or video games with fantasy aspects? Or maybe there are movies or TV shows in that genre that you enjoy. Those can also be an entry point to fantasy for those who are interested in giving it a shot. In fact, we have a couple of fantasy genre and genre blend bibliographies full of recommendations for anyone who's interested.
Well, Laura Jean's given us some things to think about the fantasy genre. Or maybe you're already a fan. So here's a question for you. What is it about fantasy that you like? Do you prefer a setting that is our world with magic or a completely original world you can explore? Who are some of your favorite fantasy characters? And most importantly, which kind of fantasy creature would you just love to meet?
Ooh, a dragon!
You are so basic. But seriously, thinking about what specifically you enjoy about a book or a genre helps us make the best recommendations. And it helps us think outside the box to help you find books in similar genres or from similar authors you might enjoy. Well, that's just about all the time we have. I hope you take the opportunity to ask us for tips on what to read next. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on TBP Voices.